Welcome to the Question Lane, where the goal is to solve problems through the process of questions and answers. Today's guest is retired chairman of the Department of Psychology at Florida International University in Miami, Florida, and the author of the book that we will discuss today, The Beast in Florida, A History in Anti-Black Violence. So welcome, Mr. Dunn.
Thank you.
Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to interview you. How are you today?
I'm great.
All right.
Doing all this rain, but otherwise I'm fine, thank you.
Well, we'll get through it. All right. What would you like to be referred to as? Dr. Dunn, Professor Dunn, Mr. Dunn, Marvin, any other?
Either of those works. Since you're much younger than me, I think
Mr. Dunn?
Mr. Dunn would be a little bit better.
Okay. I will go with that. Mr. Dunn it is. Okay. Before we start the interview, I like to focus on words and definitions. And the first word I want to focus on is racism. And I picked up this definition from Gusty Renegade's show, The Cows, Context of White Supremacy, and I really agree with this definition, so I want to see what you think about it. So the definition for racism, white supremacy, is a global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they classify as not white. Do you think such a system exists? And is that definition accurate?
The definition is not accurate. As a matter of fact, it's far from accurate.
What is inaccurate about it?
Racism is the belief that one's own race is superior to other races. For that reason, you could have black racism. And there are black folks who believe that blacks are superior to others. Does racism exist among whites? Yes. Is it injurious to our society? Yes. Are there organized racist groups that would destroy blacks if allowed? Yes. But that definition of racism is far too limited to apply to what I believe and know racism to be. And I've taught courses in racism.
So just to be clear, a non-white person could practice racism?
Oh, yes. For example, there are folks, I used to attend Black Muslim meetings. I've heard Malcolm X speak back when Malcolm was of that view. I heard Malcolm speak in Atlanta when I was 17 years old. Shocked me to death. He was on the stage talking about how superior blacks were to whites, how whites had a tail that was prehensile, black of the berry, the sweet of the juice, all kinds of references to whites being beasts, inferior to blacks, and blacks being superior to whites. So yes, black racism does exist. Now you don't have the kind of power in black hands to act on racism as those whites who are racist have. But yes, black racism does exist. As a matter of fact, that was racism among the Seminole Indians in Florida. Seminole Indians held blacks as slaves, some of them, not many, chiefs primarily. They had a view that blacks were inferior to them. So almost any society that I've looked at has the view that blacks are superior to that particular society.
Okay. The next definition I want to focus on is terrorism, because you use the word terrorism quite a few times in your text. And my definition for terrorism is intimidation via psychological, economic, or physical violence. Do you think that definition is accurate?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Well, we have agreement there. Okay. So the book that we're going to discuss today is The Beast in Florida, A History of Anti-Black Violence. For quite some time, there has been a meme on the internet. Are you familiar with what a meme is?
What is a meme?
A meme is a photo accompanied with a statement or a phrase indicating the absurdity of the photo. So, for example, a meme that's been going around the internet is something that's been described as Florida Man. And what Florida Man is a concept of headlines that has been broadcast around the internet and on the news. So, for example, you will have a story that says, Florida Man has been accused of shoplifting at a CVS and calling the cops on himself. Or Florida Man has been accused of taking opioids and stripping naked in the street. Just outrageous, outlandish stories about Florida men, quote unquote. Are you familiar with some of these outrageous headlines that come out of Florida?
No, I'm not.
Okay.
News to me.
It's news to
I'm
you.
not surprised.
Well, it's popular on the internet.
Who's it put out by?
It's put out by a lot of different news outlets. You'll have an outlet that might talk about a case in Florida where some man does an outrageous thing. I just thought that is fascinating because there's a lot of crazy acts of Florida men in this book, which we will get into. First question. In today's current society, who do you think is more confused about racism, what it is, and how it works? White people or non-white people?
Oh, white people.
Why are white people more confused about racism?
I didn't say all white people, but I think in general, whites are more confused about racism. Most white people who do have racist views deny that they have them, or they rationalize those views, or they allocate them to past generations. But racism is endemic, I think, in white society, even those folks who consider themselves to be moderate. But because of the, I think, psychological need that has been historically present among whites to consider themselves to be more privileged, better equipped, more intelligent than blacks, I'd say white racism, confusion about it, is more apparent among white people. I think for blacks, because we see it so often and experience it so often, I don't think there's any confusion. I don't think there is as much confusion about racism among blacks as there is among white people.
Okay, so when you see or hear stories in the newspaper or on TV where you have white people calling the cops on non-white people for sleeping in a common area of a dorm, like you might have heard recently about a Yale student, or a family barbecuing in Oakland, California, where a white woman says that they are illegally grilling, although they are in the legally permitted section in the park to grill. Or when you see musical artists go to California for a concert and stay in an Airbnb, and they are unloading their suitcases and they don't wave to the white neighbor and they call the cops. How would you describe that behavior? Is that confusion by white people? Or do you think that is conscious acts of racism practiced on a part of those white people?
I think it was a combination of fear, suspicion, and racism. If those same people you just described were white, they probably not have called the police. But you understand, there is a certain pervasive fear among many white people, even well-meaning white people, of black people. You know, I've had people, I'm 78 years old, I meet a white person coming on the sidewalk, and they'll cross over rather than pass by me. Some of that, we as black have sort of played into that, with the whole image of being thugs and being mean and being, confrontational and all that. So to some degree, I think, particularly among young blacks, there's some playing off of that white fear, but it becomes dangerous when police officers have it. It becomes deadly when police officers have it. And I think one of the reasons that we have seen so many shootings and unfair police tactics being used against blacks, particularly against black males, is because there is a pervasive fear of black men in particular among many white people that you see exhibited in the kind of behavior that you just described.
Okay. I don't want to harp too much on this, but I do want to make a point on this. So if I'm restating what you said correct, the way that black males dress today and the popular image of being a thug or a gangster, is that you think is the common reason why whites might have a fear of black people?
Well, first of all, most black men don't dress like that. So I'm speaking about those folks who decide among themselves if they want to appear to be that way. So they wear the pants around their butts, around their thighs. They have that kind of swagger that is intended to communicate that message. But I don't think most black men that I see dress like that or try to send that message. But it doesn't take many to instill the view among whites that all black males have this kind of thuggish view. So yes, there's some black men who played off with this. I think some black music capitalizes on that, makes millions for people based upon this view of blacks being thuggish and dangerous and mean and anti-white. But that does not describe most black young men that I know.
Because correct me if I'm wrong, I'm only 26 years old, but rap music was started in the late 80s. Before the late 80s, a lot of black men was wearing bell bottoms and suits.
Yeah, I did.
You did? Afros.
I still got my bell bottoms.
They wore.
Put them on, but yeah.
They wore the most respectable attire that you could, and they still was targeted by police officers. They still was targeted by white people. So that's just an interesting point you've made. Okay, next question is, during the time period that was discussed in the book, which is pretty broad, late 1800s to all the way up until 1950s, which is a large time frame. Who do you think in that time period was most confused about racism and what it is and how it works? White people or non-white people?
Well, I don't think white folks were confused about racism in the period that I'm talking about. I think that there was and speaking now about the South in general, and we're talking about the period after Reconstruction, 1870s, up until the 1950s or early 60s, when Enlightenment supposedly took place. No, there was a view, particularly in Florida, that blacks were ex-slaves, that they were inferior to white people, that they were not worthy of being in the same schools as white children, and that if a black person, man or woman, or child for that matter, stepped out of place, that they should be taught a lesson, including the extreme remedy of being lynched. So no, there was no confusion about that, and I think blacks felt themselves vulnerable to this kind of terrorism. Cowed by it in many cases. Of course, there were some instances where black people stood up to it, but for the most part, lynching and anti-black violence in the period that we're talking about was very effectively implemented by whites, and it had a very deleterious effect on the psychology of black people in this country, in the South in particular, and in Florida especially.
So would it be correct to say that during the time period that's discussed in your book, white people were not confused about racism during this time period, but now they are?
Well, I think that there was a lot more acceptance of white superiority in the 1870s and 1880s and early 1900s than there is today. I don't think that the attitudes among whites, or blacks for that matter, that existed in the 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s are the same as they are today. So yes, I do believe that today there is less overt, certainly there's less legal practice of racism, but attitudes have changed over a period of time. Doesn't mean that everything is rosy for black people, because we see instances that can be quoted as recently as this past week, that there's still a problem of racism being still an element in our society, and that it is still a dangerous element in our society, as I was mentioned earlier, especially when we see it practiced by police officers.
The extrajudicial killings that occur today by white law enforcement officers and non-white law enforcement officers, that matter as well, and also white citizens. Would you equal that out to modern day lynchings as they occurred back then, as they are occurring now with these extrajudicial killings? Well,
I'm not quite sure what you mean by modern day lynching. I have a very specific definition of what a lynching is, as opposed to an assault or murder.
How would you define a lynching?
Well, it's not necessarily my definition. There was a group that met at Tuskegee University some years ago, involving whites and blacks, who decided what it meant to be lynched. What it meant was, one, there had to be a dead body. So some people said, well, this person just maimed and not killed. Had to be a dead body. It had to be, the killing had to take place outside of the law. It had to be carried out by two or more people. And the motive for it had to be racism or revenge, basically. So that's what's meant technically by a lynching. Now, have we had acts of violence that meet that standard in modern society? Yes. There are a few instances where blacks have been actually lynched, meeting the standard that I just defined to you. But they're compared to 1830s, 1930s, 1910s, we don't see it as much. I think, listen, we do a disservice when we overuse the term lynching. For example, Bill Cosby made the argument that what was happening to him was a lynching. That's absurd, and it does. It's not like I think he compared himself to what happened to Emmett Till, the Mississippi young boy who was lynched back in the 1950s. We need to not overuse a term that has all kinds of historical legitimacy because of what happened to black people to try to apply to situations today where it has no relevance.
Okay, now we're going to get directly into the book. What do you mean when you say that the South had a morbid preoccupation with sex?
It did. It did.
What do you mean?
Listen, I looked at mentions. There were a few mentions of white people, of white men. Not many. I'm talking about Florida. I don't think class across over 7th. But there were instances where white men were lynched for their cattle rustling and even murder, but not very many. But I didn't find a single instance in which a white man was sexually mutilated, made to eat his testicles, where his private parts were spread around as souvenirs of the event. That didn't happen to white victims of lynchings. It did happen to some black victims of lynchings, particularly those who were accused of assaulting or insulting white women. So if you go back to even slavery, when slaves were disembarked from slave ships, black men were described in terms of their ability to be strong bucks, to be able to work hard, to be able to deliver on the kind of labor needs that whites had. And of course, they were standing there naked. So their genitals were evaluated and compared. So there was a big preoccupation with black sexuality. Black men were considered to be sexual beasts. White women were considered to be, black women were considered to be exotic somehow or another, loose sexually and what have you. So yes, there were these preoccupations with sex among whites that translated into anti-black violence.
The morbid preoccupation with sex that Southerns had. Would you think it would be more accurate to replace the word South, the word South with white, when you say the South was morbid preoccupied with sex?
No, you could. I think that it was beyond the South. I think that there was the same sort of attitude about black sexuality throughout the country. It's just that in the South, where 80% of the black people lived until the Great Migration of the 1930s and 40s, Southern whites were more closely in physical contact with blacks. And so these stereotypes were more easily spread and adopted in the South. Plus the fact that there was such close physical proximity between whites and blacks in the South, there was more opportunity for conflict, more opportunities for blacks to get in trouble with confronting white people or not obeying the social mores. So no, I have no illusions about whites in Boston, for example, or New York, or any place else, having racial attitudes that were not all that different from the South, particularly including sexual attitudes about blacks.
Okay, I'm going to skip ahead in the book a bit. Former Florida Governor Sidney Katz, who was in office from 1917 to 1921, he insisted that the Negro is an inferior race. If that's the case, why was education for Negroes so staunchly opposed by him if they were inferior?
Well, for one thing, there was a view among whites at that time that blacks did not need to be educated, that their jobs were going to be in the field, that their jobs were going to be taking care of babies for white people. They were going to be basically menial laborers. So why would a black person need a high school degree or diploma, much less a college degree. So blacks were stratified in terms of their expectations to participate in the labor market, such that there was a sense among whites that they didn't need to be educated. Plus, educated blacks would be competing with white folks for the jobs that were considered to be white jobs. So back in those days, you had what was considered colored work, which meant work that required you to sweat, and white work, which was work that didn't require you to sweat. So that was basically the view about education. And that extends back into slavery, where there was the realistic expectation that a slave who was able to read and write was dangerous. And they were dangerous. And for this reason, it was against the law in some states to teach a black person to read and write. And the few who did manage during slavery to read and write were done so usually secretly by their owners or by mistresses or the children of their owners. So the suppression of black education began from the moment they stepped on slave ships up until and through the 1960s, when finally federal court orders broke down racial barriers in education.
In Governor Katz's response to lynching in March 1919 to the NAACP, he replied that the white citizenship will not stand for indictment of racist vigilantes. Mm-hmm. Is that not exactly what is going on today on modern day all white juries as what we would call jury nullification?
Well, yes, there's still some of that. As a matter of fact, that is why we had the race riot in Miami in 1980. There was an all-white, all-male jury in Tampa, Florida that convicted, that found white men, police officers who had beaten an innocent black man to death, not guilty. An all-white jury. But you know, a classmate of mine, Judge Wilkie Ferguson, who was a federal judge at the time that he made this ruling or influenced this ruling, he was an appellate judge, state judge here. And in the aftermath of the McDuffie decision, rendered by an all-white jury, Judge Ferguson was able to get the courts of Florida to adopt a standard that race could not be used as a basis to exclude people from serving on juries. So you have a less likelihood of having all-white juries hearing racially sensitive cases today than in 1980 when the McDuffie jury fit this model, and its decision caused 18 people in Miami to die. Most of them were black.
Okay.
You know, could I just say something about Sidney Katz?
Yeah, get on the former governor.
Sidney was he was dangerous. He was not unusual in the fact that he was a racist. It's just that as governor, with the responsibility as the chief executive of the state to protect all of his citizens, he didn't. And beyond that, he even encouraged anti-black violence by saying, well, if somebody insulted my daughter or attacked my wife, I'd get a gun and blow his brains out too. But this is the governor of the state of Florida saying that if I am in that situation, I would do the same thing that any God-fearing white man would do. So he was not just racist, he advocated anti-black violence. And even though we had other racist governors, there were a few who actually came out and did what Sidney did. And that's why I find him to have been the most solid, the most dangerous governor we've ever had in Florida.
Speaking of politicians and law enforcement officers, are you familiar with the Blue Lives Matter movement?
Yes.
Okay.
Tangentially, yes.
Recently, there's been quite a few passed laws in certain states, for example, Louisiana, which makes an attack on an officer tantamount to a hate crime. So if an officer is attacked in any way, shape, or form, they are compared to protected classes who were previously attacked in previous years and currently as well, such as African Americans, gays, Jews, etc. Does laws such as these Blue Lives Matter laws, harken back to Governor Katz's suggestion in 1919 that blacks would not be lynched as much if they did not kill white officers?
Well, first of all, police lives do matter. I respect police officers who carry out their duties in a professional way. I can only imagine how chaotic any society would be if you didn't have police officers. I don't agree that you should classify an attack against a police officer as a hate crime. That's far too global in a use of that term. Hate crimes ought to be restricted to those groups that have been specifically singled out to be attacked because of their race or their sexual orientation. So I think it's much too broad a use of the term. But I have a lot of trouble with folks who just blanketly come out and say all cops are bad. We don't need cops. Because I've seen, listen, I was out there when the 1980 riot happened. I saw what could happen when there's no police officer present for a day. And it was not pretty. I saw white people being killed in the streets by black young men with hundreds of people, including myself, watching, and nobody doing anything about it. So I think, unfortunately, the Blue Lives Matter movement arose in contradiction to the Black Lives Matter movement, and that's too bad, because black lives do matter, and black lives are more at risk of danger from reactive police officers or racist police officers. So unfortunately, the two things have become commingled in a way that I think is unfortunate. But I do want to make the point that there's no advantage to be gained in assuming that all or even most police officers are dangerous and that we don't need cops, because we do.
I just want to establish that there is a pattern of behavior and practices by people who identify themselves as white as it relates to black people will get less mistreated if they would avoid harming white officers. This goes back to Sidney Katz days, and this goes back to today. I'm just trying.
Well, no, you're absolutely right. No, listen. The main reason for black lynchings in Florida, and possibly beyond Florida, the thing that would get you lynched even before raping a white woman was killing a police officer. Whites simply would not stand for that. A black person who would kill a cop, who would attack a law enforcement officer, was considered to be so beyond the pale of law that that person deserved to be killed. So the view that an attack on a police officer was especially inciting of violence against black people, not just the person believed to have done it, but against black folks in general, is very, very true. So technically, I guess it is true. But see, a lot of the accusations that blacks attack and kill white police officers was based on a lie. It didn't happen. I could give you a number of examples, including what happened in Ocoee, Florida, in 1920, when the view among whites was that some black people, headed by a guy named July Perry, who had tried to vote, and this led to this confrontation at July Perry's house. You have these black men inside the home shooting out, protecting themselves, and surrounded by a white mob, and two white men got killed. Both of them were law enforcement officers. And as it turned out, they didn't get killed by the blacks inside the house. The white folks shot them by shooting through the house. But the riot was caused, in addition to the voting dispute, by the word getting out that, the niggers had killed two law enforcement officers. Nothing set white folks off like that, even alleged assaults on white women, like the rumor or the actuality that a black person killed a law enforcement officer. The last lynching in Dade County, in Homestead, was around that very issue. And Willie Gray Simmons, the black man, did kill a white constable. There wasn't any question about that. He killed him. He shot him. And that led to his lynching and that of two other people at the time. So sometimes there were instances in which confrontation between black people with the police led to a police officer being killed or shot. But often the anti-black violence after that swept up a lot of other people who had nothing to do with it.
We're definitely going to get back to the Ocoee riot incident.
Ocoee, yes.
Okay, Ocoee with July Perry. Definitely going to get back to that. I just want to note for the record, with a lot of these extrajudicial killings that occurs today, and a lot of the lynchings that occurred in the past, just has this common theme of due process not being adhered to.
That's right.
Legal convictions not being sought.
That's right.
Politicians ignoring telegrams and
That's right.
forewarnings in the Associated Press and other news outlets, and receiving calls from organizations such as the NAACP and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of spectators, men, women, and children, occurring these lynchings, what they called lynch parties. Can you explain the concept of what a lynch party was?
Yes. In the earlier years of lynching, if it was known that a person was going to be lynched, word would get out in advance. People would come from miles around, sometimes from out of state, to witness this. It was like a circus. It was a public showing of extra legal justice. So yes, lynch parties would be held. Women and children. I have a photograph of a lynching in Fort Lauderdale where there's a little white girl standing looking up at the bodies. At the body, in this case, it was just one man, Reuben Stacy. My grandmother told me that she knew of at least one lynch party in Volusia County that my daddy and she went to, and other black people went to it. So yes, these were kind of like public events that were intended to send a message, and folks enjoyed going out. They'd have a cookout before, during, and after the lynching. Now, that changed after the mid-1930s with the Claude Neal lynching, which was so public. Even the President of the United States knew it was going to happen before it happened. And this incredibly public lynching involving thousands of people who came to witness it, a few people actually did the lynching, was so egregious, so outrageous, that after that time, those kinds of lynchings, the circus atmosphere type of lynchings, diminished, and lynchings became more private affairs where the person's, the white person's family, or the victim, if he or she survived this alleged attack, would then take someone out privately and lynch them.
And the Claude Neal lynching is the lynching that occurred in 1934 in Marianna, Florida. Is that correct?
That's right. It was particularly horrible lynching. I talked to Claude Neal's, to family members of Claude Neal, who still bear the psychological scars of what happened to him. I met his daughter, who was a little girl when her father was lynched. And she told me, Dr. Dunn, every time I pass by that courthouse where they hung his body, I still see my daddy hanging there. And she was in her 80s when I interviewed her. So these scars last a long time. People die with the memories of their loved ones having been lynched.
Like I said earlier in the podcast, I'm on the younger side, but I always, just reflecting back on my childhood, I would remember how my parents would say, "Hey, get inside the house before the sunlights come on. Get inside the house before it gets dark." Now, this is in Miami. We're not in a rural area. We're not in the country anywhere, and this is not 1930s, 1940s. Can you explain what the word sundown town means?
Oh, yes. A sundown town, any city or town that has the word beach in it, was a sundown town. Any word, Miami Beach included. What it meant was that black people who were in that town had to be out by the time the sun went down. Otherwise, they were subject to arrest. unless they had a pass, a written authorization from a white person giving reason for them to be in town after dark. So people knew, get out before the sun goes down.
And that's referring to Dr. James Lowen's book, Sundown Town.
Yes.
Interesting book for the listeners out there. It'll let you know that this definitely was not a Southern phenomenon as relates to people classified as black needing to be out of town when the sun goes down, or having a signed pass as if you are.
It was apartheid.
As if you
Same
are.
as in South
As
Africa.
if you were a child. And if you are familiar with, are you familiar with Mr. Neely Fuller Jr.?
No.
Mr. Neely Fuller Jr. wrote a book called The Compensatory Code System Concept, a textbook workbook for victims of racism, white supremacy, where he gives.
Oh, interesting.
He wrote this book in the late 70s, and he's put out a revised version in recent years. But essentially, he talks about giving counter-racist suggestions for what victims of white supremacy need to do in order to counter the system of racism, white supremacy. But he believes that under the system of racism, white supremacy, everybody that's classified as non-white are essentially children in this system of white supremacy. So getting a permission slip definitely sounds like something a child would get in class.
Well, it was more than just getting a permission slip. My mother was a maid on Miami Beach in the 1950s. I still have her ID card that was issued by the Miami Beach Police Department with her fingerprints on it. And she had to have that card on her when she was at work on Miami Beach. The prevailing view was that black people would steal. So the police would already have your fingerprints on record to make sure that they could fine you if there was some theft where you worked.
Okay. Another thing we want to discuss here is the convict lease system that began in 1877. Can you briefly explain what the convict lease system was?
Mm-hmm. Sure. Once slavery ended and blacks could not be made to go to work, you had certain industries in the South, the lumber industry, for example, but others that needed labor. So what was very common was that black men would be arrested on ridiculous charges, vagrancy usually, or loitering or some other ridiculous charge, and then leased out by the police department, by the county, to private employers, to a man who ran a lumber company. So this company would have the benefit of virtually free labor provided by the county in the person of black men who would have to work for nothing. So this was a very, very abusive system that eventually ended. And if you look at the convicts who were normally subject to this kind of treatment, they were most often black men.
Going back to what we talked about earlier about who's more confused about racism, white supremacy, what it is and how it works currently, would it be accurate to say that an example to illustrate that white people are not confused about racism, would it be accurate to say that modern day for-profit prisons such as Geo Group, which is up the road in Boca Raton, if I'm not mistaken, would they be a primary example of the continuation of modern day slavery and the convict lease system that has started going back to 1870?
Well, I think you're very dead on point about how these private prisons are being used as a way of making money for white people who own them. It's absolutely tragic. I'm not sure that I would relate it to slavery, but I certainly would have the view that it's very close to the convict leasing system, where these prisons have to be full in order for the private companies that own them to make money. And if you look at the folks who are in the prisons, and we can argue about why there's so many more black people, men in prison than white, the victims of this private prison system are black men. And even the current leadership in Florida and in Washington uh, gives credence and support to this mass incarceration and misuse of black people as a part of the criminal justice system.
And just to add on to what Dr. Dunn said, Michelle Alexander wrote an excellent book. It's escaping me right now. But that's definitely a good book to talk about mass incarceration and the continual legacy of this history that was started such long ago. And in this case, what we're talking about with Dr. Dunn, the convict lease system, is definitely something that has been perpetuated even to today.
Can I just mention one other thing about this?
Yes, sir.
When I was doing my research for the Black Miami book that I wrote, I looked at the jail record in Miami, Florida, for it must have been 1901. The city was less than 5 years old, and 98% of the people who were in jail were black at that moment. So going back in our history, we've always had the illegal use of the criminal justice system to imprison and exploit black people.
On page 37, you talk about a concept referred to as multiple lynchings, where on June 9th, 1895, William Collins was lynched in Lafayette County for attempted rape, along with at least two additional blacks who supposedly hid Collins from the mob. What role do you think these extrajudicial acts of terrorism plays in people classified as black not wanting to help other black people when they are identified specifically by whites as targets?
Well, there are a number of instances in which blacks who were being sought by white mobs were turned in by black people. Unfortunately. It was a dangerous thing if a black man who was being sought by the police came to your house and you helped him or hid him, the mob would then come in and lynch you. And sometimes people who were being sought were helped, and folks who helped them did get away with it. But it was a risky thing to do, to help somebody who was on the run from the police, from a mob. But what's your question beyond that? Was it?
No, I just want to know what role does that play in even to modern day times where black people don't want to help other black people when they are identified as targets by whether it be police officers or just random white people.
Okay, yeah. Well, that's a two-edged sword. If you have black folks who know that somebody black committed a murder, committed a crime, and you know the person did it, and you don't cooperate with the police, you hide this person, so this person can continue to rape and take advantage of the community with impunity because no one's going to turn them in, I have a problem with that. I think people should cooperate with the police when you know that someone has broken the law, rather than hiding it. The not squealing, that's part of the problem that we have. If you know somebody did something, tell it, damn it. What can I tell you? You got guys, and listen, I now work with murderers. My job now, I work with people heading to death row. I have 35 clients who are either on death row or who are heading to death row. These are guys that I work with every day. There are many of my clients who were able to do what they did for a long period of time because nobody told and people knew what they were doing. So, I'm not down with that. What can I tell you? I'm not down with that.
That's interesting. The snitching concept. We're going to get to that later.
You want to get to a lot of stuff in this interview. What do you have in mind? 2-3 hours here?
Hey, I respect.
You take what you can get, right?
I can take what I can get, and I respect your brilliance on this topic. What are some examples? Let me rewind a bit. There's been a misnomer that white men are the main perpetrators of racism. That if we get rid of the big bad white man, racism will be over. It's not really white women or white children. It's just white men. Mm-mm. What role do you think white women and white children play in the system of racism, white supremacy?
Well, children, to the extent that they adopt the views of their parents, most kids do that. Most kids listen to and respect the views of their parents. Those views happen to be anti-race, anti-black, and there's a good chance the child's going to grow up with those kinds of views. But as far as women, some of the most rabid racists in Florida history have been white women. Now, mind you, there was an association, I forget the exact name of it, but it was an association for the prevention of lynching, and was headed by white women with some help from black women. But the view that white women were not subject to racist views is totally ridiculous. In some instances, they utterly supported it. For example, it was a common thing for a white woman who was caught in a compromising position with a black man, having sex with a black man secretly. It comes out, and then she would accuse the black man of raping her, of forcing himself on her. Very, very common. I can give you case after case, including Rosewood, where this, and that still happens today. So white women don't get any free pass from me. Now, you you will be able to show that in terms of acting on violence towards blacks. Men were the ones who would organize themselves in mobs and go out and kill people, but often at the behest and encouragement of white women who totally were in congruence with their views.
You briefly spoke about the role that white women played as it relates to being abusive towards black domestic female workers. Can you explain some brief examples of how that mistreatment occurred?
Well, yes, it was typical for black women who worked in the homes of white people, white women, to be subject to all kinds of unfair abuse, not just in terms of payment, what they would be paid for their work, but tricks that would be played on them. For example, when my mother was a maid, she told me that the white lady, one of the white ladies that she worked for, would put a penny under a rug. And then if that penny was still there when my mother left, it meant that she didn't clean the house good. All kinds of things to question the honesty of black women who were working in these homes. It was. I don't mean to suggest that all black women who worked as domestics were abused, although I think most of them were abused in terms of pay because they didn't get paid what would have been fair for their work. But just one example: when a white lady, a boss lady, would bring a maid home, including my mother, who was a maid, and my grandmother, the maid had to ride in the back seat. You couldn't sit up front with the white lady. My mother couldn't let her boss lady know that my father owned a Cadillac, because if they saw the Cadillac, they'd think that we didn't. What are you doing? Why do y'all have such a nice car? So my father would have to park the car across the street before the white lady brought my mother home, so she wouldn't see that nice car that my dad had. So, you can overstate it, because I also know that my mother worked for white women who were very helpful to us, who would send food home, who would give money when my mother needed it. But overall, I think domestic workers were exploited economically, were mistreated psychologically, and were subject sometimes to abuse in terms of how they were supervised by the people they worked for.
If I'm not mistaken, I believe a lot of black domestic workers, specifically female, was tasked with being a nanny, raising the kids, nurturing the kids. I'm talking about of white children, that is, male and female.
Yes.
What role do you think that black domestic females' inclusion into their lives, being nurturing figures at early ages, shaped as it relates to them being future racists?
You mean the children, the white children, were nurtured by these black women?
Well, I mean, a lot of white children during the 40s, 50s, and 30s, they were supervised by black domestic female
raised by. You're right. Raised. About even given breastfed by them.
What
yes.
as nurturing as a mother and child could be, even though they were not their mothers.
Yes.
What effect do you think that had on their upbringing and their potential role in being future racists?
It was what psychologists call fencing, racial fencing. That is, the person will put a psychological fence around a black person and say, now, Mama Sue is all right. She raised me. She's a good nigga. Her husband, old Joe, these are good niggas. So those blacks that some whites had a close personal relationship with, domestic relationship with, they could excuse them as being different. But that did not influence the attitude about blacks in general beyond those who they had close contact with. I mean, I would hazard a guess that there were Florida sheriffs and constables, white, who were breastfed by black women, and they still led lynching mobs later. So there was no guarantee that the person was going to grow up with a particularly sympathetic attitude towards blacks just because they were breastfed by a black woman. Then some of this goes back to the vanity of white women who were so anxious to not have their figures ruined because they were nursing their babies, would have a black woman do it. Would have such social obligations, those who were of a status that they had those kinds of obligations, could just leave the children with a nanny and go out to the teas and all the kinds of things, bridge playing that they wanted to do, and leave their children in the hands of black women. Now, a big cost of that was on black children who were neglected because of the non-presence of their own mothers who were raising other people's children.
Can you describe the concept of alien Negroes in Miami?
Oh, yeah. Gosh. We still are living with that. Well, when Miami was founded early, late 1890s, the black folks who came to Miami and to Florida in general came from two different directions. Many came from Georgia and South Carolina into Florida, North Florida, and then on down as Florida developed as a state. And then many others came from the Bahamas and other parts of the Caribbean, but mainly the Bahamas. And these people came first to Key West, and then they would migrate up the Florida chain of keys into South Florida. So you had this melding of blacks from two different cultural originations. And there was a view in Miami that among whites now, we talk about black views, African American views about Bahamians as well, but speaking now about how early Bahamian residents in Miami and Dade County were viewed by many whites, they were seen as alien Negroes, not like the southern Negroes that were more easily understood and controlled. Black Bahamians who came in to Florida in the early 1900s, late 1890s, considered themselves to be subjects of the British Crown, as indeed they were. And many of them had a very haughty attitude about African Americans, that you all just got out of slavery. We Bahamians have not dealt with slavery for a much longer period of time. So there were ethnic and cultural tensions even between blacks, African Americans, and Bahamian immigrants. But the view that many whites had was that Bahamians are more dangerous, more likely to resist being made to respect certain kinds of social norms, that they were more likely to participate in anti-white violence, as indeed they were. The first race riot we had in Miami was in Coconut Grove, led by Bahamians, who simply would not accept the kind of oppressive tactics that whites were using at the time. So, yes, there was a view that they were alien, they didn't really belong here, but they were needed for their labor. So they were kind of tolerated for that reason. But that was the use of that particular term at the time.
So I'll just restate to clarify. So correct me if I'm wrong. So at the time, white people who were in control, they suspected all the Negroes, whether they were Southern Negroes or Bahamian or other Caribbean Negroes.
That's
they
right.
Were
black was black.
The black was black, and they were not confused about that.
Well, unless the Bahamian opened his mouth.
Okay.
And then, they tell that Bahamian twang, and that was an alien nigga.
Okay. But the blacks that were here in the United States, descendants of slaves, if you will, they were confused about racism a bit, and the Bahamians were confused about racism a bit because the Bahamians were out of slavery for a little bit longer and had a little bit more cornbread or pecans or whatever the currency we want to use, which made them think they were better than the Southern.
Well, in some sense, in some regards, they were better. They were better educated, for example. They came out of a British education system in which Bahamians tended to have more education than did African Americans who were from the South. So in that sense, they were correct. But see, now you get into my own prejudices, because the Bahamians overplayed that and considered themselves to be superior to African Americans, which caused a lot of problems. My father, who was our family goes back to Georgia, did not like Bahamians. He thought they were, I don't want to perpetuate, but I don't think my dad's views were all that different, but he thought Bahamians were too loud, ate too much fish, had this strange religion, Episcopalian. The women were too mouthy, too bossy, and the men had little butts. And he said they wouldn't stop working. And my dad was a longshoreman. He said the Bahamians wouldn't take a break. The African Americans, when the break time came, they'd stay an extra 25 or 30 minutes. But the Bahamians be right back on the job. So, the black men would say, hey, yo, goddamn, why don't y'all slow down? Shit, what you trying to do here? So you had these tensions on the docks in Miami between Bahamians and African Americans. And, that was part of what I grew up with.
So it'd be safe to say that they were confused about their place.
You keep using that term confused.
I'm using the term confused because understanding your place within society, and that we are all, just to quote Dilly Fuller Jr., we're all, as non-white people, we are all at the bottom of the slave ship. We're all victims of racism, white supremacy. Some people are in slightly better positions. God save the queen.
Then I agree with you. I see where you're going. Yes, I think there was confusion.
Meghan Markle, she just got married to Prince Harry, if I'm not mistaken. Wow, that's a great achievement for African Americans. We finally have some melanated people in the royal family. She's in a different position, but she's still at the bottom of the slave ship with the rest of us. Now, does she get a little bit more cornbread than I do? Possibly. Does she get a little bit better treatment? Possibly. But she's still a victim.
Well, all right. I think I agree with you about that. Black is still black. It don't get at a certain level. But you also have to recognize the fact that if a person becomes, a black person becomes extremely privileged, extremely wealthy, extremely well known, a black athlete, a black entertainer, for that person to say, well, we're still black. I'm just as subject to being discriminated against as you are. And here, a multi-millionaire telling me, or somebody who has less than I have, that we're all in the same boat together. We all came over in the slave ship, and I'm just as much a risk as you. Well, that's stretching reality a little bit to me. True, that person could be beaten up on the street by a white police officer as fast as you or I could be. But you still have certain privileges if you're a black person and you're rich and well-educated that other blacks don't have. And yes, you can trace all that back to the slave ship. We all came over in the same condition. But the difference is over time. The privileges that develop over time based upon skin color, mixed bloods, having certain advantages over field blacks, all of those things translate into differences that really are real. But I guess I would agree with your use of the term confusion based upon that description.
And just one more comment before we proceed. I just want to make sure, just for the record, that what you said is 100% accurate. The more money you make, the more of prestige that you get in the society. We need to acknowledge that that does, to some degree, separate us non-white people to some degree. But we just have to keep in mind what system we're in and the consequences of not understanding that system. The pound cake speech that Bill Cosby gave about black people need to pull their pants up, that's true. Black people need to speak with better English, that's true. Black people need to get more educated, that's true. Black people need to avoid portraying a gangster image, that's true. But he's not in such a great position these days. And Morgan Freeman was asked on, recently about, not recently, but I recall an interview that he gave about race not being an issue, and
that's ridiculous.
It's not as much as a problem as it was before. And
well, that's true. It's not as much of a problem as it was before.
One of my favorite actors he's getting ready to bite the bullet. But again, that's racism, white supremacy. All right, the next question I want to get into, the portion of the book about the Newberry lynching. Stella Young. Who was Stella Young, and why was her lynching especially heinous?
Stella Young was the wife of a man who was believed to be heading up a gang of black hog thieves. And Boise, what was Boise's last name? I forget Boise's name at the moment. Just check it out for me. But Stella was the husband of a black man who was seen as the head of a uppity group of hog thieves, and the white folks in Newberry, Florida, became concerned about this gang of alleged hog thieves, and a white constable went out to Boise's house to arrest him. Actually, 2 white men went, 3 actually, and Boise ended up shooting this white constable, and that set off this chase in Alachua County, where Newberry is located, to find Boise Long might have been his name.
Yeah, Boise Long, that's what it was.
Boise Long. Yeah. This mob gathered to track him down. He managed to escape being captured for a while, but his relatives were rounded up, including his wife, who was pregnant at the time, Stella Young. She just kept her name. She didn't take Boise's name. And Stella and 5 or 6 other blacks were taken to the Alachua County jail, the Newberry jail, where they were taken immediately by a mob to the outskirts of Newberry, to what was called the Hanging Tree, which was an enormous oak tree, incredible tree with massive limbs that had been used as a lynching site for years in Newberry. And they took these people out and hung them all together, including Stella Young. When she dropped, her neck was broken and she was heavily pregnant. The child was expelled at the time that she was lynched. The baby was caught by a white woman who was attending this lynching and given to a relative of the Long family who raised this boy. And then after the lynching, the bodies were eventually cut down, stacked like cordwood, and Stella Young's body, her corpse, was placed beneath that of the male victims. And I have a photograph that I found in Jacksonville in Duval County Library years ago of this pile of bodies. And I took a very close, it's on the cover of my book, in fact. And once I scanned in on this photograph, I noticed a woman's face beneath the others. And that was Stella Young. These people who had committed this lynching, which was the largest mass lynching in Florida history, took place in 1916, were apparently ashamed that they'd lynched a woman and tried to hide Stella Young's body beneath that of the other lynch victims. But that's what happened in Newberry. It was all over the alleged stealing of hogs that then exploded when this constable was killed by Boise Long. Boise did shoot him. There was no mistake about that. But that was the largest lynching in Florida history. And that lynching tree, I went to Newberry several times doing research. A black man who eventually became a county commissioner and city commissioner in Newberry told me that tree had been cut down back in the 1950s. But that for over 100 years, that tree stood as the place where they lynched black people.
Interesting. And very tragic. At this stage in my life, I try to.
I'm sorry. Can I tell you one other thing about the Newberry lynchings? Because I talked to a black lady who, the place where they lynched these people is called Lynch Hammock. It's right outside of the city of Newberry, Highway 26, going into Newberry out of Gainesville. You run into Newberry.
Can you repeat that name again? They said Lynch
Hammock.
Lynch Hammock. Okay.
It's a very lot of large oak trees still there today, so it's a very dark place. So even in August, it's cool in Lynch Hammock. And I used to sit there and have a beer thinking about what had happened there. But a black woman who owns a part of that property, she's an undertaker, let me roam the property with her. And she said she didn't know that was where the lynching tree was when she purchased the property. But they say she was told by people who were alive at the time that when Stella's body fell and she was lynched, that the moon came out and it was like the sun had come out, and it scared the white people and they ran away. She said, Dr. Dunn, today if you come out here on a full moon, it's like the sun is out, just like it was that night they killed these people. She says it's very scary to be here on a full moon night.
So it's almost like an ominous reminder of the incorrect behavior that happened on that night.
Yep.
At this stage in my life, I try to do my best to avoid name calling and mistreating to the best of my ability fellow non-white people, because as I continuously said in this interview, we are all victims of white supremacy.
Which we got to wrap up pretty soon.
That's right.
So
That's right.
The other main ones you want to ask me about, you better get to it.
We're gonna get to it. Burley Jones. Who was Burley Jones, and what was he, and what was Burley Jones' role in the Ocoee riots?
Burley Jones was a former slave. He lived in Ocoee, Florida. Ocoee is very close to Orlando. It's in Orange County. In 1920, a major lynching took place there. The part of the black section was burned down. But Burley Jones was the black man who was the essence of what it means to be an Uncle Tom. When two black men tried to vote in the 1920 election, July Perry being one of them, Mose Norman being the other one, and the rumor got started that because they were rejected from the polls, that they had gone and armed themselves and got other blacks to their house, to July Perry's house, to defend themselves against whites who were going to come to question what they were doing at the polls. This rumor that these blacks were arming themselves was perpetuated among a small group of whites until Burley Jones told his ex-boss man, the family that owned him, that it was true. So now whites had the verification from a black man that July Perry and others were armed inside July Perry's house with the intent of confronting any whites who came there. So he was the one that, in a sense, helped to set this event off. And then once the riot was all over and blacks left Ocoee, there were no black people left in Ocoee except one man.
And who was that man?
That was Burley Jones. Burley Jones stayed in Ocoee until he got so old that the white folks got some money together and put him in a nursing home. And it wasn't until the 1970s that blacks began to go back to Ocoee.
Wow, so being Uncle Tom kind of pays off, right?
Burley Jones was not the only Uncle Tom who got some benefit from being an Uncle Tom. There were many instances of black resistance that was tipped off by black folks who told.
All right, I got 3 more questions to wrap it up. Earlier we talked about the role that white men, white women, and white children play in racism. What if you could recall, there was an 11-year-old girl who spoke about the Ocoee riots to a newspaper. Do you recall what she said and her comments were? Her comments was, all the fun we had when some niggers burned up.
Oh, yeah.
Does that sound like a ignorant person?
No, it sounds like a child who was subject to the anti-black views and racism that was endemic in her family. And she reflected what was a pretty common attitude among some whites who attended lynchings, which was that it was an event to be celebrated. It was an event to have some sort of a public gathering so that people could witness this.
Okay. And to get back on snitching, this is 2 more questions left. To get back on snitching, who do you think endears the concept and practices the concept of not snitching the most? White people or non-white people?
I don't know the answer to that question.
Well, I'm asking in the context of, because on page 118 we talked about, not 118. We talked. There was an incident where a lot of white male witnesses saw Bryant Hudson shoot Sam Carter, and
Oh, I see where you're going.
nobody told in that situation. And if I'm not mistaken, to quote you, you described it as it was typical of the era.
That's right. It was. White folks didn't talk. You're right. You're right. That's why lynchings were so rarely brought to any sort of legal response, even though in many instances that people had talked, still nothing would have happened. But yes, that one reason that anti-black violence was so rampant and so infrequently pursued legally was because folks kept their mouths shut. But that was because it was their sons, their husbands, their brothers, their cousins out there doing the lynching. So, very few white people actually participated in the lynchings in terms of actually being there to commit the murders. But almost everybody kept their mouths shut. And that is what gave license to lynch parties.
White people don't snitch.
I didn't say that. No, but you see, you just...
That's what I'm saying. Let's not quote Dr. Dunn. That's what I'm saying. White people don't snitch. White people don't snitch.
They didn't snitch then.
Yeah. But all right, on page 118, you describe an example of whites who help blacks, and this is relating to the Rosewood incident. For example, the Bryce brothers, James and Creighton, during the Rosewood massacre, they allowed some black people.
They're on the train.
They allowed black people sanctuary on the train, but there was a caveat to that. That was black women and children, because you stated that the white mob's target were men and older boys. What age do you think constitutes a black male being viewed as an older boy?
13.
13 years old.
Yes, in the Rosewood massacre, when the Bryce brothers used their train to sneak it into Rosewood to evacuate black people, they didn't allow any men, only women and girls, and no boys over 13. Because the view was that if a boy was pubescent, he was dangerous. And that if that train had been stopped and there were boys over 13 on it, then it would endanger the rest of the black people and the two men who owned the train.
I love my black women, but let's remember this is some of that black male patriarchy and a lot of those black male privileges. Remember that back then, no sanctuary for us, and today, no sanctuary for Tamir Rice, who died when he was 12.
Well, the first lynchings that I knew of in Newberry, and the use of that hanging tree that we mentioned, involved the lynching of two black boys who were 12 or 13 years old for stealing a watermelon, which they probably didn't steal. So just being a child is no protection against being not being lynched. Black children were lynched. But you touched on something about the Bryce brothers that I do want to mention that should be mentioned. Every place that I went, except Ocoee, I found evidence of white people, a few, who helped, who did the right thing at the right time, either hid the people that worked for them or that they knew personally. In some instances, rare instances, even white police officers tried to prevent victims from being taken by mobs. So you got to give some credit to those few whites who did the right thing in those horrible moments, because they get lost in history. And in my research in Rosewood, a lot of the white folks who talked to me complained about this. They said, listen, my folks tried to help the black people. My folks hid black people, and they could have been killed for doing it. But when that Rosewood movie came out, it looked like all the white people were mob members and out to kill blacks, and that simply was not true. It's not fair. And they were correct about that.
Well, let me give a suggestion to maybe some white listeners that might catch this on YouTube or any other platform. If you want to help a black person, snitch on a white person for me, and that'll be a great testament to show me that you're dedicated to countering racism, white supremacy. on page 119, you quote Ernest Parham, I believe is his name? Parham,
yeah.
Who said that it was not the more refined whites of Sumner, referring to the neighboring county of, the neighboring town of Rosewood, who caused the problems in Rosewood. What do you believe he meant when he used the word refined?
And nobody meant.
What did he mean?
He meant that the whites who participated in the Rosewood Massacre were the backwoods white people, the poor whites. It was not the refined whites. But he was wrong about that. Because their photographs, including the photograph that I have in the front of this book, The Beast in Florida, just to get back to the name of my book.
The Beast in Florida, A History of Anti-Black Violence by Dr. Marvin Dunn. Let's get that on Amazon and let's spike his sales.
The photograph on the front of this book that shows these lynching victims of the massacre in Newberry has photographs of men in business suits. And I had white people that I interviewed who told me who these people were. I have the names of most of these people who are standing around the bodies of these Newberry victims, and they were not poor whites. So Ernest Parham may have been gilding the lily a little bit about who actually participated in that particular event.
To quote Neely Fuller again, racism, white supremacy for fun, glory, and material gain. Got to keep that in mind, non-white listeners.
And our last question is what?
Last question is, Harry T. Moore, what role did his and his wife death play in a legal context as it relates to the FBI?
Harry T. Moore, with the possible exception of Osceola, was the bravest man who ever walked in Florida. He was a school teacher in Brevard County on the Florida Space Coast. Back in the 1930s and the 1940s, became the principal of a black school, and he led the registration of blacks as NAACP members in rural counties, rural areas in Florida. He also criticized white sheriffs for participation or covering up lynchings. And eventually, Harry T. Moore and his wife were killed when a bomb exploded beneath their home in 1951, Christmas night, probably set off by the Klan. And Harry T. Moore was so well known even outside of Florida because he wrote to the NAACP leadership in Washington and New York. He wrote for black newspapers outside of Florida, so people knew who Harry T. Moore was. And his killing, and his wife also died, was of such national importance and was covered so broadly, even in the Soviet Union, that the FBI became involved in pursuing the justice in the lynching case for the first time. So that was the legal significance of the Moore lynching. But Harry T. Moore should be recognized as Florida's greatest martyr ever, the greatest martyr, and his wife that we can note in terms of resisting anti-black violence in this state.
Harry T. Moore and Harriet Moore as well.
Yes.
All right, I'd like to thank my guest, Dr. Marvin Dunn, author of The Beast in Florida, A History of Anti-Black Violence. Where can we find a book? Do you have any upcoming events or anything to promote?
Well, this particular book is no longer in print, and it's a very expensive book. It costs $124 to get this book on Amazon, so I think it's going to be outside most folks' interest of capacity to just buy this book. But my last book that came out just a couple of years ago is entitled, A History of Florida Through Black Eyes. And that's available on Amazon, and it's reasonable, and it covers some of the same material that this book does. So I would encourage people to look for The History of Florida Through Black Eyes on Amazon if they don't want to spend $124 for this particular book that we've been talking about today. But both books cover some of the same things. And I do have appearances, but not many. I can't cite which one is next, but I do speak sometimes at schools and colleges, and there's some scheduled, and they're on my Facebook page. So if someone wants to follow me on my Facebook page, that's the best way to tell where I might be speaking or what may be coming up next. Just friend me, Dr. Marvin Dunn, and you'll be able to follow my schedule to the extent that you wish to.
Okay, so we'll probably get that in the description about the new book, and also your Facebook page where people can find you if you have any upcoming events, and also to buy your new book. Again, thank you, Dr. Dunn, for your time and inviting me on this rainy day.
You're welcome.
Thank you.